The essence of the carbon tax was to try and both encourage us to use less fossil fuels and promote alternative lower emissions technologies. But what the governments didn't want to explain, and much in general said there is a consequence to that, there is a price to that. I think the important thing in relation to carbon tax is that it's essentially, people understand that this country has a lot of coal and gas, and that is both a natural advantage but also is an environmental consideration.
The journalist's role is not easy, but I think what the journalist has to do is to try to understand that complexity reasonably well, and any particular article has to be put in that kind of broader framework. That means they need to understand how the energy markets work. They have to understand what are the options that exist in terms of generating electricity. They have to understand the human behavioural and the vested interests that are actually controlling the way the system is today, and also superimpose on that the fact that we do have to change. We can't continue to make these emissions into the future that come out of burning gas or burning of coal. These have to be reduced over time. So the journalist's task, I think, is to understand enough of that to be able to draw out from companies, from governments, how they're going to move, recognise where we are, that's the reality, how we're going to move to where we need to be in the future, which is generating all the energy that people need, but are doing it with less emissions. I think I've dealt with hundreds of journalists over my career, and by and large most of them hold quite dearly this whole idea of providing balance in any argument, and I can understand that. I think that's a reasonably justified situation. The problem is that there becomes a time when the argument is so unbalanced that it is quite non-productive to do that, and you could give examples about, journalists don't speak a lot about the people who deny the existence of continental drift anymore, and there was a time when that was the case. There was an argument going on because it's overwhelming evidence that we have that. They don't argue generally about the whole question about evolution, biological evolution, but here in the case of climate change we still have this imperative actually to try to provide the deniers of what is now an overwhelming case from the scientific community that there is a climate change problem, it is occurring, and if we don't do something about it, then that's to the detriment of us as a human race, our children and our grandchildren, but also all of the other living organisms that we share the planet with. So journalists are working within an environment in which there may be editorial impacts and on what they can actually publish. They're dealing with this whole issue of having some sense of balance, but they need to go beyond that. They need to actually show leadership. They need to actually lead the way in terms of creating a view of the strength of the climate change science and what that's really saying, and what in terms of what we need to do, but also what will happen if we don't do it.
I think the thing that has got lost very much in Australia in the last 2 or 3 years is that we got completely caught up in this issue of price. And so even at the last election, the debate seemed to be which of the two governments was going to have the lowest carbon price. And yet there was no discussion around, well, what are we actually trying to do here? I mean, there is an issue we're trying to grapple with, and the issue is what's the most credible way to have an impact on climate change? And everyone, I think, logically agrees what we should be doing is looking for the lowest cost way of doing it. But you've got to remember what we're trying to do. It's a bit like, you take your child to the doctor, and the doctor says your child is really sick and they need to have this injection every day, and if they don't, they'll die. And then the child, you go home and the child doesn't like the pain of the injection. So after a couple of days, you get very sympathetic towards your child, and you think, oh, the pain is terrible, I'll stop giving them the injection. Then someone reminds you, if you don't keep giving the injections, your child's going to die. And it's like that. I mean, people get distracted by the day-to-day costs of climate change. And to pretend that this is going to be a cost-free policy change is, in my way of thinking, simply wrong and misleading, because people start to believe it, and it's not true. I mean, this will not be a cost-free change because there's a fundamental reason, and that is right now we are the emissions of greenhouse gases is occurring in a cost-free space. We're not costing the environmental damage of the CO2 we're emitting, and so that means that we are subsidising fossil fuels today. And until we fix that cost, to complain about the cost of renewable energy is simply misleading.